Okay, dude. I'm not sure how many of these will fit in each box. You'll have to also forgive me for the cat hair. These were boxes that we were letting the cats play in. Okay. Obviously, you know Alice in Wonderland. Everybody does. That's the whole point of, I guess, this collection, in truth. The entire idea of going down a rabbit hole is due to this book. So that whole fundamental concept was generated here. And this was all done by Charles Dodgson, who was a mathematician, very wealthy socialite, and published books under Lewis Carroll. Everybody very famously knows that Alice Liddell was who he based Alice off of. So you can find her pictures in here, and like the very first, I guess, from the first photographs he ever took until the girl who he based his most famous story off of, and much further beyond. Now, I warn you, this book has naked children. It's classified as a historical artifact and, document or whatnot. But because it has naked children, I feel like you need to at least be warned. And then why he was so into taking pictures of naked children is another topic for a different video. But where Alice in Wonderland really comes to life for me in the story is here. This girl right here, Julia Arnold, that is Julian Huxley's mom. Julia, and Julian was named after Julia. You can check in the index for all of their pictures, and you can look at her and her sister were like early subjects. The Arnold family was like I don't want to say like, they had famous writers and they had like really famous thinkers, but they weren't quite at the same social level of like a Charles Dodgson or Galton or one of these families that are more of, this is Victorian society. So they kind of had their social classes, and sending your daughters to one of these places was, to one of these men who would do whatever they would do, is part of society for a really long time in Britain. It's really interesting, actually. There's a whole nother thread that we'll talk about a little bit here. But where this ties even deeper into the rabbit hole storyline is the entire idea of the looking glass, like Alice through the looking glass and the sequel to this, and where this all goes. The portrait, not responsible for the story, but very relative to the imagery that we all see from it, that is actually Julian's mom. So that's a really fascinating thread that no one else has ever really explored. And I think that's because everybody typically just focuses on Aldous, and Julian, even though he was like the establishment figure, once eugenics kind of got into the taboo, the area of the taboo, Julian still never relented. And in doing so, his work kind of got separated from the lexicon, even though his work at the time was foundational to everything that was being built. So, like, just as an example, he's the very first, historian of biology. And he's able to do that because he had access to all of his grandfather's books. And, his grandfather, T.H. Huxley, was obviously like one of the foundational pioneers of the modern scientific structure. I mean, from the Royal Society to the secret clubs and the the circles within the circles, and even the idea that experts have the final word. Like, his work was the very, like, the birth of expertise. Fascinating life. And you can actually, you can learn a lot about that and a lot about him from, where is that book? This is a very good book called The Huxleys. It's a new book, a little expensive, but good. And it's a good read, and they even have an audiobook of it that's not bad. It's a little bit more from the feminist perspective than other Huxley histories, but it's done by the same woman who made, let's see, oh, there it is. Who made probably the best book on eugenics ever published. You have this now too. This is the Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics. Excellent reference book. Not as good of a reader as this one, but this one really tells a lot of the story of just how important the Huxleys were to science. And it was really relieving for me, having been really ingrained in the Huxleys for years when this came out, to see that I was on the same wavelength as this lady. Because we both kind of saw the same thing, but she published the book and did a really way better job than I could. And she talks about this thread a little bit, but not so much the videos that I was making. Like, it was about foundational thought, about how foundational thoughts set into ourselves. So like from the political angle, I was going to tell the story of like Thomas Paine, common sense, how we say even the idea, the notion of common sense comes all the way back to Paine. And then, you know, when we say things like the rabbit hole, or like, you know, this man created insanely dense meaning within like these phrases that should be nonsensical. Like, what do you mean further down the rabbit hole, or into the looking, you know, we all know what those mean, but anyway, those foundational thoughts also get carried over into the work of the science and the academic establishment. And that's where all of the threads kind of tied together in my work. And that's really the source of this rabbit hole here. I have many more books, but a lot of those belong to my ex-wife now. And I only had the books that I needed while I was on the mountain. And that's just, this was the rabbit hole I was in at the time. So I was still reading through and using these for the video that is never going to get finished. So that's why all of this exists, really, is because of Lewis Carroll and these two books. Fascinating. This book, Julian Huxley, Memories, this is probably maybe the first book you should read if you're into it. Like, if you're into this rabbit hole, it's fascinating. And from this book, it actually unlocks a lot of other books. Through reading his work in here, you can do, you know, supplemental reading of like TVA, like this is like Adventures in Planning, and then also like his historical work. This is his grandfather. Like I said, because he had access to his grandfather's journals, which knowledge was very limited at the time. Like, access to books is a big deal, and access to the knowledge of the man who created the idea of authority made you kind of the ultimate authority, like the authority of authorities. And that's kind of the role Huxley played. And he did that a lot of times by publishing his grandfather's work. And this one is Touchstone for Ethics, and he gets to call himself kind of a co-author of it, because he brings his grandfather's work all the way into the 40s and then kind of tries to tie it together, do a little bit of apology, a little bit of explanation of like why their ethics were different than the ethics. But it's also a really good read because it kind of lays out what their concept of ethics was, like why the academic establishment thought the way they did, and then how, like, the turning points where they started thinking differently. Like, just as an example, like T.H. Huxley had these ideas in his head, like black women don't feel pain. And this was like back when surgeries were still done in public and stuff like that. So he, like, they used like to have notions about not giving them anesthesia and like just, you know, some things that just didn't hold up over time. And so he kind of helps to balance that out, and also starts kind of tackling the different ideas of race and evolution, and becomes an authority on all of these figures just by publishing his grandfather's work while working in prestigious careers befitting of his education and title, which again you get to learn all about in his memories. It's a very, very good book. If you only read one chapter, I would read the chapter about him meeting H.G. Wells. It's got maybe read that chapter first, and the rest of the book might just open up for you. Like, you might actually get really interested in him because it's so cool. That's where the science of life comes in. And I had that book, but I gave that to Scott as a gift for helping me animate the episode on it. And so that's missing from this collection, but that's kind of like an encyclopedia of all scientific understanding at the time, published by H.G. Wells under the authority of Julian Huxley, who, having a Huxley tied to his work, made Wells an authority, and then having Julian tied to a Wells book made him a celebrity. So he really that was the book that made him the first celebrity scientist. Like, and he would go on to like be the first celebrity scientist documentarian, and like all the things that led us to the Attenboroughs and all of these other figures of the future, Julian kind of paved the way for. And a lot of that is in this book, and it's fascinating. So I will put that inside of here. And he also talks about his mom and his brother. And one of the cooler things that comes out of it too is you learn that when they were writing The Science of Life, he was overworked to the extent that he had to have his brother and his brother's wife come out, and every day him and his brother would do all the necessary reading and writing, and then their wives would type all that shit up. And during that time, and you'll read this in the chapter, Wells is sending all of these angry letters, and H.G. Wells becomes kind of a joke a little bit to them. And that's a lot of where Brave New World actually comes in. Brave New World is based on a couple of things. Wells, Wells was publishing a lot of science fiction stuff that was super just idealist, and it's not necessarily a full critique of that. Like it's billed as a satire, but at the same time, it's an advancement, and it's this new school. And you'll read in this book too, which is by J.B.S. Haldane. It's a lecture he gave, very tiny little book. Not a great reader if you don't understand what you're reading, but it's basically him, a brilliant mind in the same class of Julian, and you'll read about their friendship in here. This is JBS, or Jack Haldane, one of the most important scientists of all time. This is where the whole idea of outside embryos comes in, like the embryo farming, like humans outside of the mother. And in Julian's book, actually, that's one of the things that Ashley picked up on. I'll put that in there too. Julian was fascinated by his grandfather's concept of the water babies. And he had all these questions about the water babies. And it was this idea of growing children outside of the womb. And of course, I think he's talking about these formaldehyde jars, and things like that you would see around a laboratory. But anyway, this idea really first comes out here. This is where this guy's basically forecasting the future of science, and also cutting down to size the earlier generations, and mocking H.G. Wells a little bit in this. So that's a fun read. But then all this takes Jack's ideas and H.G. Wells's premises, and that's where Brave New World comes in. And let me tell you, this is a really good version of Brave New World, and it's got a foreword by Christopher Hitchens, and really good book. If you haven't read it, important reading. Another book that's kind of just like on the outskirts related, that I'll put inside the same box, is this Bertrand Russell, I'm sorry if everything's backwards, The Impact of Science on Society. This is just a really good book to get a foundational critique of the academic establishment of the time from probably one of the greatest minds to ever live. And it's really solid, just background knowledge. But anyway, on the same thread, although since this is the Adventures in Planning and the Touchstone of Ethics, I'll also put those in there, but they're more on the supplemental reading if you really want to get down deep into the rabbit hole. And I'll also put in Alice in Wonderland, because that's a big book. Oh, and you may want to read this, you may not, but this is my copy of UNESCO, Its Purpose and Philosophy. You'll read a little bit about that in Memories 1. But Julian also published closer about his work, like the relevance of like UNESCO and like what he did. These two are really like, if you want to get into the UN side of Julian's career and like his thoughts on this and like where all this comes to be. But interesting stuff, and you'll have to forgive me. This was back when I was really first getting into this stuff, and I made a lot of markings in here. You might see that. And then also some things that I write might be wrong, because that's where I was like, this is how I got into the population control aspect of the UN, and seeing how ingrained this was, and then even finding out like, who is Julian Huxley? So this was fundamental for that, but also fundamental for that, even more so, I would say, like if you were going to read, like if you actually wanted to know like the state of the times and like how population control relates to like the moral and ethical philosophies of the establishment, it comes in through evolutionary humanism. And these are ideas that he talks about in his memoirs, and then Ashley talks about in the Huxley biography. But when you read it himself, and this is like a compilation of different, and also marked, so you'll have to forgive me, different speeches and lectures and publishings around the idea of evolutionary humanism. And it's impactful because humanism has become basically the church, the secular church. And he didn't found humanism, but his idea of giving the church a scientific authority through the principles of evolution, like this, he was really the reason that Darwinism held up. Like, believe it or not, Darwinism started to fall out of favor in the 20s, from the 1900s through the 20s, really with the rediscovery of Mendel, and then in the 20s and 30s, you even have like the Lysenko, brainworm that got into a lot of people on the socialist side of the discussion, and the struggles of asserting Darwinism as an actual thing first came with the re-explanation of what Darwinism is and how Darwinism is actually right, but they were just wrong about a few things. And that is something that he published in his book, Modern Synthesis. And that's like, if there was a scientific authority book that he's responsible for, it was bringing all of these different ideas of evolution together into the Modern Synthesis. And that was published in the 40s. And then later he would go on to like host the first, Darwin Centennial, and like just really the champion of Darwinism by the authority of being, Darwin's bulldog's grandson, and like the authority of the of the Royal Society and all of these offices that his grandfather helped build, he solidified into the modern consensus. Like, that's Julian's role, like that. I mean, beyond just a popularizer of sciences, but he'd also go on to found what is now international humanists. He would found the first real, what was it, the World Wildlife Fund, like the conservation unions that would come to be the main engines to push the environmental movement forward. That's what Julian was behind. And that was all through humanism, believe it or not. Okay. So we've got the whole concept of humanism. In here, something else that's missing from the collection is new bottles for new wine. There might be some excerpts from that in evolutionary humanism, but I forget. But that and modern synthesis and a lot of other stuff like that that's missing from the collection is usually available on the Internet Archive or in a PDF form somewhere. Most of the books I own are because you couldn't get a PDF and I wanted to read them. So that's why a lot of them. Now, through the Julian rabbit hole, you can go a lot of different directions. You can get into the history of the science. You can get into the movements, like the population control movement and the birth of the environmentalism movement. You can get into the UN. It just goes so many directions. So the Huxleys and the books that are in here in that particular rabbit hole, I would say probably maybe the best way to approach this, if you were to actually wanting to dig through, is get into eugenics a little bit. Probably the best way to do that is, the history of eugenics is really great. You if you wanted to just sit down and read this, this is a full education, and it's probably one of the. Nobody gets anything exactly right, but they just actually represent the idea in a much more honest way than a lot of other historians. And I think there is still some of that, we just want to preface this by saying everything is wrong and everything is immoral that we're about to talk about, but not as much as others. And it makes it a much better source. But in here you will also find, let's see, where did that go? There's a Francis Galton pamphlet that will be in one of these boxes, and that's worth reading. I don't know where that is right now, but it's worth reading. Oh, here it is. Probability, the Foundation of Eugenics. This is another one with markings in here from me I have to apologize for. This one blew my fucking mind, and it's so tiny. If you want to light the fire to get into the Oxford history, this is how you do it. It's like when you read Francis Galton actually talk, it's just so different than everything that I had heard in the consensus that it made me okay. And then I went on and I read the life and letters of Francis Galton, and I read a lot of other writings between him and Carl Pearson and a lot of the other foundational people, and that was a really good education. But probably the best education I actually got on and I'll put this in there too. This is the only Playboy I've ever bought and owned, but it's got an article, a population control article from Julian. So I'll put that in there. That's really. Let me see, what's the best way? There we go. And it's just historical artifact. It's actually not even that good of a read, but it is, I mean, it's interesting to like read eugenic ideas and different breakdowns and stuff in a Playboy from like the 60s or 70s. I forget when it was published. But probably the best book that you can find here if you just want to, like, if you kind of already have a grip of eugenics, you're not that interested in that, but you want to get into like actual, like the population control, like where it becomes policy and stuff. The very first thing you'll want to read is not this, but you'll want to read, it's online. There are no physical prints unless you just print it out, but there's, you can find it, it's Frank Lorimer. Frank Lorimer. He wrote it, he's like one of the OGs of demography. Him and Frederick Osborne are like the founding fathers of like official demography. Like, it's hard to explain. That's a deep rabbit hole all in itself. But Frank, Lorimer, he wrote a little history of the study of population control, and that is worth reading just to get if you read only one thing to understand population control, that is it. And then after you read that, I would highly recommend this book, which is extremely rare and impossible to find. And I'm sorry the pages are falling out, and I've read it and used it, and it's had a hard life, but it's a super important book. It's called Birth Control and Foreign Policy, and the breakdowns in this are so solid, like just incredibly solid and straightforward. The guy still has, you know, a mind of the times, and you every time you read someone's writings, you have to take in, you know, a million things about their life and the time and the backdrop. But as far as just like a collection and presentation of population control, I think it was published in like 76 or something like that, like right after the World Population Conference, and really when this stuff is at the height of its official popularity, and like where the messaging is so clearly like we have to reduce the population. That's where he comes out with this. And I think, if my memory serves, he's actually arguing for like the environmental approach moving forward, of like, instead of reducing the people and presenting it like that, going with the environmentalist thing. So anyway, fascinating read, full of great information. And through that book, I actually found this book, which is one of the best gems out there. She really outdid herself, published around the same time, but this is A History of the Malthusian League. And this is that real shit. Like, she gets right back into like the movement that like birthed Sanger and the International Union for Population studying the population problem. I'm sorry, I'm brain farting right now, but the IUSSP or ISP, anyway, almost no one talks about the Malthusian League. It's a huge hole in the historical knowledge. Like, there's just, it almost just like, to these people, all of this stuff just comes out of the blue. And they also want to like mind wipe everyone that eugenics was ever involved in it, even though all of the founding fathers of this stuff were all eugenicists. You know, it was just, if you believed in evolution and you were there at the time, then you were a eugenicist, until that became a dirty word. But yeah, they want to mind wipe everybody of that. And they also want to mind wipe everybody, it seems, that it all started from this argument for, it was like an anti-poverty movement. And it was, you know, it's just, no one talks about it, no one knows about it, and this book just lays it out great. But from that same time period, this book is also probably, if you just, you know, if you read all three of these books with that Frank Lorimer supplemental, you would probably have a better knowledge of birth control and just the population control movement than 99% of the people out there pretending to be experts about it. It's like, it's seriously, those are such a great encapsulation of everything. That like, there are other supplemental volumes in here that I'll put in a different box, but these are just like important historical documents for me to read when I was like, I wanted to like know how people thought at the time. So like, these are like the first publications of their kind, and kind of like things that I couldn't read online and that I really wanted to know about. But that's not something that you need to worry about unless you know, want to totally isolate yourself by becoming an expert on this shit. This I'll also put in a different box. This is actually a biography of the Huxleys I never got to read. I bought it because I had finished the other Huxleys, and then I saw that this one existed way late in the game. So I bought it, but I actually never read it. So hopefully this one's pretty good too. Okay, so anyway, so yeah, Huxley can take you 100 different ways. I'll also put H.G. Wells' Open Conspiracy in another box. That goes in this box really, but man, I wouldn't wish reading H.G. Wells on anyone. Like, that guy, fucking verbose doesn't even cover it. He takes, I mean, I'm on like 30 minutes of telling you about books, but this guy, he takes 30 minutes to tell you about telling you about books. It is retarded. But you can, if you need to quote mine, or you need to go back and you see him really lays bare all of the things that play out later. And him and Julian's relationship is really funny too, because like in this, he's still like building the science of life with Julian, or right about to. I can't remember, it's been a while, but then later they actually have like a huge falling out, because Wells always kind of feels a little bit like, yeah, you owe me, kid. And like later when he was doing like the New World Order stuff, that was like originally like a long lecture that he wanted to give. And he tried to basically like use his status to like make Julian give him more time to speak at some UN function than anyone was allowed to have. And then Julian was basically like, look, man, you get 45 minutes. And then they had a huge falling out after that, like never spoke again. And so Julian talks about that in memoirs, and it's funny, but like, I just always thought it was funny that their falling out happened over the New World Order. And like, there's some irony there that just pitch perfect. But that's a beautiful and unique rabbit hole. I really hope you enjoy yourself there. And I'm gonna kind of tie that back in a couple different ways. One, yeah, let's start here. Let the Cat Turn Round is a dry read, but it's one of the rarer books in here. I think it was like $80 or $90 for just this little paperback book, because you can't find it anywhere. But it's Alexander King's memoir, and wow, talk about a man of the times, and just a man who, he lived a life. He's boring as hell to read, but his life is really interesting. And he's the guy who coined the term DDT. It's actually really funny too, like him and Julian were on opposite sides of the academic establishment. Like they didn't really like each other. And there was one guy who they both worked with who was on the middle ground. And it's really interesting because in both of their memoirs, they mention this guy, and he's the guy who is credited for adding science to UNESCO. So it was going to be UNESCO, the United Nations Education Cultural Organization, and they wanted to put science into the center. So in Julian's memory, it was him and this dude who put science into the middle of UNESCO. But when you read this, it's Alexander and this dude who do it, and then neither of them mention each other. So it's just like this really funny thing a lot of people wouldn't recognize, but it's just like a funny little historical story. But you get his perspective on why DDT came about, how he got into the organizations that he did, He ended up becoming like a director of the World Bank and like one of the first directors of OECD, which is like basically the organization behind the UN that sets up all of the organizations in these other countries. Like they're the organizers for the organizers, and he is the head of that. And he also goes on to start the Club of Rome, because he's this super well connected guy who has all of the powers to get these things done, but also there's so many restrictions within the organizations they're all working with. So like, even though they have all of these great scientists and it's like getting these budgets approved, getting the work approved, like the pain in the ass of bureaucracy is very real, especially in these organizations with many different representatives and people there with different agendas and shit. So just to get things done, basically, he created the Club of Rome. And then over time, they've developed into like this huge organization. And well, we think about it in our heads as this, it's actually just like a limited amount of people at any one time. And it was really well conceived. But reading his book and his account of it puts a perspective to it that takes away a lot of the cloak and dagger. And he's also not, one of the great things about this entire box is there's almost no bullshit in it. Like, especially with this guy and Julian, they tell you what they think. And that's why he's also one of the most famously quote mined people in the world for his second or third book, whatever, but published through the Club of Rome, which is The First Global Revolution, which you can get that on PDF. Definitely worth reading if you get into this whole UN rabbit hole. But this book right here is a great source of knowledge, and it sets up the entire environmental movement as it would be. Like this whole box, the population control elements, DDT and medical sciences of the time, really pushing society to a new place in consumption and just in population, being able to sustain that many people for such a long time. One of the things Alexander King talks about is in this book is the first place that got DDT ended up 20 years later, he met a guy from the place, and this could just be a bullshit story that he's telling, but it's powerful enough because he's talking about they were running into overpopulation problems. And like, they get into this, should we be settling the areas we're settling? And then that's where a lot of like the whole concepts behind like, the deaths attributed to climate change, there's a little bit of a truth to that, because when you go in and you spray an area that used to be uninhabitable because of malaria, and then you take the malaria away, or you use environmental engineering to, drain a floodplains, well, that 20-year flood comes or something, and then you remember, oh yeah, that was a floodplains. But in that time, it's now been occupied by all these new people, and they're the ones who are now out of a house. And when you calculate up all of the places that used to be floodplains that are now occupied by people, or used to be uninhabitable, but now have to have these chemicals in constant operation that are fucking with the biosphere, that is where the actual environmental argument starts. And that's all with these guys. And these two books. So this one is the counter revolutionary work against DDT. And actually she's got a reprint. It's Silent Spring, and it's a beautiful book. And I don't know how much of it is actually true and how much of it was just their thought process at the time. But when you read it, the sentiments are what created the whole, like, a world without birds, like her argument was that DDT was killing everything, and that the life cycle was being interrupted, and that even worse, like things are, because of evolution, what were the pests that were supposed to be killing are going to evolve, and by the time they evolve, all of the other creatures that used to feed off of these animals will be gone, and the biosphere will just be irreversibly changed. And yeah, so that's where this is like really the birth of like the organics food movement. And right in the front lines there are like the Margaret Meads, and like I said, Julian Huxley even wrote an introduction for her, like a reprinting of this book. And like it's a monumental work. I covered a little bit of my series that won't fit in here. I'll put that in a different one. But that is the environmentalist side of things. And so this is really an important distinction that not a lot of people know, is that at this time, environmentalism doesn't really exist. Like even the concept of environment comes from like a progression of ideas. You know, first you have like Gestalt, which is considering all of the way the sciences all affect each other. And that's like the Gestalt way. And then the very word environment emerges as a way to just expand our understanding of like coinciding functions and like just organisms interacting with each other. And this is where like the study of ecology first starts emerging. And it's actually, you know, like The Science of Life is one of the first books to publicize or popularize the concept of ecology in and of itself. So that was in like 1927. So here we're getting into like the 1950s and 60s. And by that time, these are now, you have like academic disciplines that are coming into fruition. And within these academic disciplines, you have different schools of thought. One of them was conservationism. Now, a key difference between conservationism and environmentalism. Now, environmentalism comes from conservationism. Like all of the organizations like the Sierra Clubs and the Audubon Society, and like everything from the World Wildlife Fund to like really anything that is environmental was born in the conservationist movement. But conservationists, their goal was to preserve life on the planet for humans. Like they didn't want to kill all the birds because they wanted to have birds to appreciate for their future generations. Like they were thinking about conserving the world for humans. Environmentalists started viewing humans as a threat to the environment. So they're not trying to save the world for humans, they're trying to save the world from humans. So that is a foundational difference between conservationism and environmentalism. And that is something that just a lot of people don't understand. And that's where a lot of the debate breaks down too, is people arguing about saving the earth, but they're trying to do it for these two like completely ethically different reasons. Now, the birth of this environmentalism sect that views man as the problem comes from this book. This is the other extremely influential book. These two books are the ones that greatly inspired like the population bomb and the future works that even some of the Club of Rome work, and like the progress of these ideas come from these two books. Now, William Vogt is kind of a dumbass. I mean, in all honesty, like he's a smart enough guy, but he kind of had like just read the book. Like it's okay, but like his basic assumptions were that basically like just the more people, the more problems. And like he was all of these people, interestingly, were bird people. They were all like bird watchers and they loved the birds. So watching the bird population go away was devastating to them. And he took that into a place of like, we need to get rid of all the people to save the birds. And that was actually like one of the very first arguments for this kind of stuff. Like even the conservationist movement first started coming from people like, we got to save the birds. Like, because they were just killing birds for hats and doing all of this different stuff that, you know, watching a world where birds just flooded the skies within a couple, like one generation, watching no more birds was just crazy to these people. And we can't even grasp it because we've just been born into this world where there aren't birds just everywhere. But these people used to see birds like we have no concept of the numbers. And anyway, Walt was like a director of Planned Parenthood, and he actually coined the term population bomb. I think I talk about that in one of my videos, and like he's like one of the foundational people. That's an important historical book, because like I said, those are the ones that inspired this which is kind of like the love child that was born of all of the different work coming out together. The population bomb was the most famous, converting this new environmentalism as the predominant philosophy of the times. Even in the establishment, like this book showcases a period of time where like the Sierra Club was behind the publishing of the population bomb. And a lot of that comes from like the Stanford scientists and the UNESCO people. Like that's where all of this stuff kind of permeated. And at the time, there was actually a huge conflict you can read about in the oral histories on the Sierra Club or listen to. A lot of it is really cool. But they had a change in leadership, and the youth wanted the environmentalist leadership to take over, and the conservationists were like, these guys are too radical. They want to get rid of humans. We're trying to save the world for humans, you lunatics. So there was actually like a power struggle, and one really famous population controller got put into the head of the Sierra Club, and then like the old heads got together and kicked him out, and then like the student unions and stuff like that went together and put him back in. And it's like this whole like late 60s, early 70s power struggle that ended up getting rid of the old guard of conservationists and the birth of the new guard of environmentalism. And their huge rallying cry was this teach-in. It was, they had the idea to do a teach-in, like a week-long teach-in across all campuses, all age groups, all schools, and they created this curriculum for everybody to teach. And that's what this is. This is the Environmental Handbook prepared for the first National Environmental Teach-In. Now this is actually what we call Earth Day now. Like everything I've ever seen, Earth Day is the biggest made up, just completely memory hold event of all time. Basically, there was a conservationist minded guy from the old school who was really also just all about world peace and anti-nuclear and stuff like this, and wanted to bring the world together to celebrate Earth on solstice. And so he got all of this, like at a UNESCO meeting, he proposes this Earth Day. Everybody, it passes. Okay, we're going to have an Earth Day in, 1970. Okay, that's really cool. It passes in 69. Next year, March 21st, there's going to be an Earth Day. Okay, now many months later, at a different UNESCO conference meeting type thing, Gaylord Nelson comes up with the idea of having this environmental teach-in with all of these people, and then that passes. And this environmental teach-in is a completely separate thing. It has nothing to do with Earth Day. But it's not gaining a lot of steam, so they hire this guy, Dennis Hayes, to take over like the marketing. And he's like this kind of like Harvard hotshot kid that drops out, and this is like the rise of the hippie movement. And he's taken the environmental teach-in on more of like a radical, like Leninist, like concert. Let's do this thing, let's do that thing, let's do protests, a million ideas. And then they hire a marketing guy who basically steals the idea of Earth Day and then totally takes credit for it. And they even, like the date of Earth Day is highly controversial because they do this, like, it was on Lenin's birthday, okay? But also it was supposedly to commemorate some, like an Arbor Day or something like that, that had some state level politician had instituted like 20 or 50 years earlier. All of these different explanations. The guy who's like this famous marketing guy who stole the name Earth Day from the original John McConnell, who came up with the idea initially, and actually had the first successful Earth Day in San Francisco. They held it. The UN actually the very next day rang the peace bell and certified that March 21st is Earth Day. Like, you can find it in the New York Times. Like, I don't care how many times they try to memory hole it, it actually happened. There was a first Earth Day. And then the environmental teach-in just totally took all of this guy's shit and just completely rebranded their teach-in to be a holiday, and then using this concert format for the posters and all of this, like, population propaganda, made the very first Earth Day, instead of about like world peace and coming together and conserving the planet, it was about reducing the population. And so Earth Day as we know it today all stems from this. And like I said, this is the actual book, and if you look in it, Earth Day does not appear once. Like, there's nothing about Earth Day. Earth Day wasn't even a thought in these teachers' mind. This was Paul Ehrlich and all of the other, like, the Stanford 7 or whatever, like, all of these goofballs who were just basically radicals, and using the popularity and the engine this was providing to get on the news. And this is like Barry Calmer and other members of like the Club of Rome and stuff like that. This is where they all get into their campus popularity. Now, coinciding at that time, and this box appears to be full, so we'll start a new box. You have an old school dude named Maurice Strong coming up on his own. Now, this is a completely different rabbit hole that ties all of these rabbit holes together. Maurice Strong is probably the most important administrative figure in the history of environmentalism, period. Like, every single meeting, he was there. Everything that happened, Maurice Strong was behind. And it's a little self-congratulatory, but you can read about it in his book. And this is another one. I didn't actually make all the markings in this one. I bought this used, and it had a lot of like here, globalization is underlined. And it's like, obviously a real low tier thinker got a hold of this one. Anyway, so it has markings and stuff. Sorry about that, but this is a very important book. If the Huxley stuff doesn't really get you going, you could start the same rabbit hole here, and it would be good to have all of the supplemental stuff. But just this book alone, if you read the different sources he's talking about and the different, like, anytime he mentions a meeting, you can basically just go to the archive and watch the meeting, read the notes, do whatever you want to, and you get the entire history of not just like the UN, the environmental movements, the conservation unions behind them, how things work behind the scenes, a little bit of the politics. You get the birth of philanthropy. I mean, he's the guy who helped Ted Turner set up his first philanthropy maybe not first philanthropy, but his first, he set up the United Nations Foundation. So the first, like, United Nations based, but the crazy thing was, it's called the United Nations Foundation, has nothing to do with the United Nations. It was just a private budget that Ted Turner and Maurice Strong came up with, because with all of the anti-abortion stuff that came out of the Reagan years, a lot of the funding to like UNFPA got cut, and a lot of the population planning started going down the drain, and it was their job to figure out how to keep the most important parts of the engine moving. And the most important part is less people, because less people is less consumption. It's just this you can hear Ted Turner talk about it. It's like his life's passion to prevent the Holocaust of humanity at the expense of overbreeding, or I don't know if I phrased that right, but generally the idea was like, if we stop funding these population programs, then all of the other plans don't matter. So how do we do this? Well, the bureaucracy, the different religions, all of the shit at the UN's getting in the way. Why don't we just set up a private fund that the Director General of the UN doesn't have to ask permission from anyone to spend? He can just, whatever he wants to do, he can spend that money. So he gave him $100 million a year for 10 years, so $1 billion. And then on top of that, he also like gave a bunch of money to offset what the UN or the US had cut all the spending. So Ted Turner started kind of trying to pick that up. And that's where Soros got in. That's where Bill Gates got in. That's where it really, when the US cut the funding, that's what opened the door for all of these other millions and billionaires to start funding the UN to do what they wanted to do. It's like, okay, well, if you're not going to provide fuel for this beautiful engine that the world has made, then we'll provide the fuel and the car will go where we tell it to drive. And that's where the UN just started going this whole different direction. And you can really get that from him. This is the guy who, I mean, Jesus. He was the Undersecretary General for a long time. He was also like the founder of the United Nations Environmental Program. He was the Secretary General of the first environmental, like the World Environment, the Stockholm meeting, and then all of the successive ones. He was also he worked with like Harlem Brundtland on Our Common Future, which is the foundational document of the modern UN. Our Common Future, if you read that, it's available online. That lays bare everything that happened after that. That was the rebranding. So in 1984, Reagan was basically, he was cutting all of this UNFPA funding because of abortion. And there was other funding cuts and such like this too. And they had to come up with, how are we going to, from an administrative standpoint, rebrand this thing to not only be more effective, but also to completely sidestep all of these barriers. And that's where you get this 3-year push that ends up resulting in like the Chevron deference ruling that was game changer. And then you get Our Common Future comes out of this think tank that basically got assembled of like Maurice Strong and Harlem Brundtland and all of these other like big heavy hitters in the administrative world, where they come up with like, well, we got to start teaching the children that the world is more precious than their lives, and to think about extrapolate the consequences of more births. And this is where it really entered the phases. If you look at the UN, everything moves in like 5-year phases. Well, from 1987, these documents took about 5 years to get into the Rio UNCED meeting, where it was like, that's where the new environmental like laws of the world were reestablished. And that I've got documentary stuff on that you can watch if you ever want to. But that's also where the World Economic Forum gets involved. This is where young global leaders become a thing, and they first start these things, because it was all about implementing these ideas out to the world through the administrative structures. But even beyond that, you can get into like the Ted Turner stuff, where he started getting into like Captain Planet and the children's education angle, and the people who are just like, well, let's get around the parents and go straight to the kids. And that's when everything really became about the kids are our future, the kids, because they can tell the kids what to think. And then that's what's going to shape who they are as adults, because you can't change an adult's mind, but you can lay the foundation for how a kid will perceive the whole world. So I mean, and the craziest thing is like, if you read like, okay, so this rabbit hole is kind of that Brave New World rabbit hole. And if you read Our Common Future, she even ironically, I think, like in a straightforward way is like, we're going to build a braver new world, you know, like they're actually pulling these ideas and they're taking from that, like, you know, the transhumanist and humanist philosophies, and like, you know, obviously it goes straight through like UNEP, for example, is a humanist symbol. Every time you see an environmental symbol or a population symbol, it's the humanism guy. Like, the humanism is the secular religion authority center is where all of this stuff is coming from. So Yarvin calls it like the cathedral or whatever. This would be like the environmental wing of the cathedral. And yeah, Maurice Strong's life is right at it. To call it the center, he's the heart, you know. It's not just the center. Like, that fucking guy knew his stuff, and knew everybody, and had a cult, and anything that happened that is interesting and worth knowing, he was involved with it. I swear. You follow this guy's life, and he's like one of those trail guides that just leads you right to all the good shit. Like, he has the maps. And then these are just some supplemental documents that I had to buy to read, that are he and David Rockefeller, their work together kind of is what these are about. And these are like the Changing Course is kind of about, so it's a global business perspective on development and the environment. This is where like the ideas of like environmental credit scores and, you know, like these kind of stuff, this is all coming out of this section of thought. It's like the transition of business to start thinking about the cost on the environment. And then it's all the people who own the lands and bought up all of this developmental stuff that now say like, okay, well, let's regulate the hell out of things so that they can't be developed until we have technology to develop them wiser, because we're only ever going to have this amount of minerals, land, all of this stuff. Right now, we're a little primitive. Let's wait until we advance, and then we can have this stuff. And by then there will be more people and the stuff will be more valuable. And it's like, it all resonates in a logical way, and far less evil or cloak and dagger than a lot of people want to believe. It's a lot of it is kind of from more of a father, a caretaker perspective of like, oh, these poor idiots are going to kill themselves. Or just, you know, you see how many things they've done wrong, and like you're traveling to all these countries and you see like, oh, well, there's no regulation on any of this shit. Well, how can we regulate it? Okay, well, let's do this. Okay, well, how can that be an authority center? Well, we got to get everybody to sign off on it. Then you have the unsaid and everyone signs off on it. And so again, this is like the think tank stuff behind that. Just a little bit of supplemental reading. And I'm sorry, this is going to be a super long video. But if you're going to read all that kind of stuff, or like just having it makes you feel good, it's better that you know what it is. If you were only going to read one book just for fun, just like a good read, and then also come away with like a lot of fundamental knowledge of like how society came to be, I would say probably one of my favorite books of all time is David Rockefeller's memoirs. Believe it or not, this is so good. Like, it's so good. There's an audiobook too. But yeah, fucking great read. I mean, he's obviously a little bit full of shit sometimes, and everybody remembers themselves way better than they are. But man, one family, if you follow their history, you can get so much. The Huxleys is probably my favorite, but my next favorite would be the Rockefellers. And I'm also going to put, this is Titan. I wouldn't suggest ever reading it because it's a little dry, but and it's big. It's good. It's not perfect, but it's okay. That's the biography of Rockefeller Sr. And that's actually, it's really good. It's far less written from like the he's an evil piece of shit type thing, and just more of an analysis of the man, and tries to be way balanced. But Ron Chernow, I've read other books of his too, and he sometimes talks a little bit out of his ass, or like repeats the stories he wants to hear. But those two books, I mean, within those you have 100 years of social engineering history, just, or at least a million other rabbit holes to dig through with just those two biographies. Okay, let's see. Oh, yes. There are two books missing from this collection that you should know about. I have them in Thailand. I actually left them because they relate to the work I'm doing there. But Leaves of the Tulip Tree is Julian's wife. That's her biography. Now, that's a little rarer. You'll have to buy it if you want it. Very good, though. Like, it's actually way more mask off than Julian's. Julian is a lot of fluff history and a lot of, like, self-congratulation and stuff like that. But her book pulls back the curtain on all this sexual deviance and about, Julian's, like, not closet homosexuality, but, like, his bisexual nature. And in his memoirs, he actually talks about, like, or hints at, like the being at an all-boys school and, like, the traditions of fagging and stuff like that. But in her book, she goes in a lot more detail about that, and a lot more detail about Huxley as a sex scientist. And, he was involved in the Kinsey stuff. I mean, really everything that is monumental about that era, he was involved with in some way. And she gives a very good perspective. She was an incredibly intelligent woman, and just, with a wife's insight of her husband's life, and not a perfect life. And anyway, you get to see it if you get really interested in that section. The other book that's missing is in the Rockefeller section, and you can actually get this on PDF. It's The Next American Revolution, and that's John Rockefeller III. And he is the most important person to tie all of this together, even more so than David, because David, he's really more on, like, the banking and the business side. David Rockefeller went on to be, like, the head of major financial institutions, like the World Bank, the Council on Foreign Relations, like all of this, highly influential political figure, highly influential business figure, really saw boundaries and borders as, like, the enemy of business. Really, the Rockefellers are the first ones to really start pushing for these international businesses, because drilling and oil is an international business. So they are the first ones to start pushing these policies through into, like, in an official capacity, and with the money to actually get it done. And they're also, like, the people behind, like when you get into the political stuff, like what's his name? Kissinger. Like, Kissinger was a Rockefeller man. And, like, the most interesting thing about their family is they're on both sides of every single debate, because they were funding just so much. So, like, I just want to, like, missing John's perspective is doing you a disservice if you want to get into this chapter of history, because John was he was born right into this period where environmentalism was first becoming a thing. And he's actually the one who was funding the conferences, and he's the one who had all the world leaders sign the World Leaders Declaration He's the one who gave the check to the UN to build their foundation. Like John D. Rockefeller III is the most important figure in the history of population control, easily, because I mean, the Rockefeller Foundation even built like the institutes that produce the experts in population come from Ford and Rockefeller. Like those two organizations were like the ones who built the entire academic concept of a population expert. So any roles that got filled came from Rockefeller or Ford graduates from these prestigious institutions that they built at colleges. A lot of times they were alumni of, or that they were just society figures. And now David is on the other side of like he controls like the art. Like, so they also control like the modern art movement a little bit. So they have their hands in so many different things. And then Lawrence Rockefeller, who is one of their other brothers, spelt like Laura because he was named after his mom. So Lawrence, but like Laura instead of Lawrence. And he was actually Maurice Strong, that other guy I was just telling you about. He was his business partner. And those were so like really through the Rockefellers or through the Huxleys, you'll get so much, like either one that interests you more, you can really dive into. But if you're going to get into the population or environmentalism, reading The Next American Revolution will also tie into like the humanist ideas and like where all of this stuff is coming through in the administrative mindset. Now, outside of the administrative mindset and the social engineers of it all, we have this other emergent conglomerate of deep thinkers, the cyberneticists. And these, like, the cybernetics is probably one of the most misunderstood subjects out there. It's basically like, a lot of people talk about it like it's like robotics or that it's anything, but it's not that. It's how systems work. It's systems thinking. So it's this cybernetics, the Macy conferences from 1946 to 1953 is like one of the greatest references in all of human knowledge. Like these meetings are where foundational ideas were born that shape not only the internet, but shape how conferences are happening. Like, just as an example of how this ties in, the Macy conferences are where the idea of UNESCO conferences come from. They wanted to have like these type of conferences before the Macy conferences. It was always, conferences were only for experts, and it was experts in one field, and they would all go meet together and they would discuss their field, and that was a conference. The Macy was the first idea of getting all of these experts from different fields together to try to start making sense of one another. Like, how does your thing work with my thing? And start seeing the world through this whole different perspective. And the stories that come out of here are mind-blowing. Like one really fun one that you can read about in the New Earth catalog, and I would recommend reading this. It's Margaret Mead and her husband, whose name escapes me. Anyway, they were big, and Mead and her husband were like foundational members of the Macy conferences. And they tell this story about how feedback, like how we use the term feedback, actually comes from an attendee at the cybernetics conference not understanding what the term meant. And so he started saying it like in a way that like you're telling someone good or bad feedback. Like that whole definition of feedback started from him not understanding the technical definition that he had heard at the Macy conference, and then going and saying we should give each other feedback, and then explaining what feedback is. And he actually explained the concept of feedback wrong. And now that wrong understanding is how we have the whole saying of like, I'm going to give you some feedback, or can you give me some feedback on this? And it all, like I said, the whole concept of getting all of these people together comes back into this book. And it also, I mean, talk about geniuses. I mean, Herbert Wiener, I know it's Wiener, but I can't remember if it's Herbert. I think so, Herbert Wiener. Wiener coined the term cybernetics. The book that he coined it on was The Human Control of Human Beings. So it's cybernetics, the human control of human beings. So if that lets you know a little bit more about how deep and integral this knowledge is, it's like, this is not only like computer history, this is systematic thinking, this is revolutionary to the education system, revolutionary to administrative systems. Everything changed after this. And yes, the CIA was super involved. Even before it was the CIA, they were already involved. Like there's a lot of the psychedelic, like the MK Ultra shit comes out of here. Like there's a lot of stuff that plays into this world. Like the people in attendance are behind all of those things later. So because of that, a lot of the stuff you'll hear on cybernetics is very cloak and dagger, and a lot of like there's a famous like alternative documentary or whatever that's just the whole thing is intrigue and suspense music and everybody's evil. But it's really not like that at all. Like if you start paying attention to cybernetics and you start listening to the people, there are a lot of really powerful thinkers. And yes, a lot of them had mindsets that we disagree with, but most of them were actually in it for super noble ideas, whether they're right or wrong. But a lot of it is noble thinking. And cybernetics is where we get like the predictive sciences, and where we get things like the Club of Rome's first study, The Limits to Growth. That was a huge publication for cybernetics. That again, that's just systems thinking. Actually, Danilo Meadows wrote one of the most foundational books to modern systems. It's called Thinking in Systems, and it's very elementary, but she lays it out really well. If you want to just like read a good overview of systems thinking, Thinking in Systems, like I said, it's super elementary. A lot of it is like listening to a woman talk. You're like, okay, yeah, no, I get it. And just, oh, really? This thing that I already know about, you're going to tell me about it. Okay, I'll listen, and so a lot of humoring her, but she is she's brilliant. She's more brilliant than me. But within that whole Club of Rome, cyberneticists, leaders of academia movement, we get Brzezinski. And this is Between Two Ages. And this is also a very expensive book to buy. But it is fascinating, especially for the time it was published. He's kind of laying out a lot of the problems and just kind of thinking through a lot of the stuff that it's either prescient or influential. A lot of this stuff is hard to tell, Is it prescient, or did they predict that things were going to happen? Or did things happen because they kind of laid out the roadmap? Almost like the same argument I bring up with Brave New World all the time. It's like, was it prescient, or was he just kind of delivering a State of the Union, to people who were just way out of touch with the conversations that were actually happening? Now, that's some heavy thinking shit. Like, you can't do that with drinking or like any kind of it's hard to cybernetic yourself with any drugs other than caffeine in the system. But one systems thinker who you can get super drunk and enjoy, or smoke a bunch of pot and just zone out with, is Buckminster Fuller. And he is responsible for the idea of seeing Earth as a spaceship. This is really the dawn of space exploration, and he was like the creator of the geodesic dome and like one of the forefathers of the conservationist movement that also successfully transitioned his status into the environmentalist movement. And like, he just has so much influence, it's ridiculous. But he's a really fun thinker at this time and highly influential on other thinkers. And, you know, not just other thinkers, but like, you know, Rockefeller, like, you've seen my episodes on, my first episode on Spaceship Earth. That came to be based on Buckminster Fuller's book, like his concepts of Earth being a spaceship. And Maurice Strong was responsible for organizing this big conference, and he was trying to get everyone on the same page. But part of doing that was like finding a good way to deliver this information, you know, in a way that's not just like here are 6 volumes of a book, be sure to read this before a meeting. So he wanted to do the survival of Spaceship Earth as like a series to give to all of these policymakers, and he couldn't get the UN to sign off on it. And so he had he had these experts, like he had Barbara Ward and the other scientist whose name escapes my mind, but the other people involved with survival of Spaceship Earth, he had them doing this whole thing where they were writing their own books to popularize this idea, and those were all supposed to be interwoven documents to help educate the administrative signers, the people with signing authority at this UN event. But the UN bureaucracy was slowing them down so much that John Rockefeller III just ended up funding it, and like they still were able to put the UN's name on it. But if you read it, it's really clever. It's something like, and he explains that in his memoir too. But yeah, it's like they basically had they were able to use the authority of the UN without getting approval to have it be an official UN document. So just like a fun administrative intrigue side rabbit hole there. Okay, that is pretty much like, if I was gonna say like the important books, that's probably it. I'll throw in some other supplemental reading. Like this is like the Greenhouse Glasnost, if you're interested. This was like Maurice went to go work for Robert Redford's Sundance Foundation, and this is where like global warming started coming out. This is where the Soviets, basically like Robert Redford funded this whole thing, kind of like Ted Turner was doing, of like funding US people and Soviet people to work together, even though they weren't allowed to. So in their big issue was global warming. So that was like, global warming was bringing the world together a little bit there. And then there's also other like, Rules for Radicals. That doesn't need an explanation. That's just a good reference book to have. Bertrand Russell, Free Thought and Propaganda. Just a fun, timely read, quick read. This is Chase's A New Deal. So this is a Fabian socialist who basically influenced, this is who like Roosevelt took a New Deal, the branding, like the naming of it from. So it's interesting to read like the Fabian socialist stuff, but the socialism is a whole nother, getting into that stuff, it's just, you basically got to become a scholar, listen to lectures and all of that crap. And then, okay, so I've got that all fitting into 2 boxes right now. And then we've got some trash books that, I don't even know, maybe I shouldn't send. So right now we've got those 2 boxes. And then we've got, Future of Heredity. Yeah, that's good in the supplemental. Okay, so we've got 2 boxes full of books, not huge. And then we've got probably enough books. We've got Future of Human Heredity, which is just another, I'll put that in the reference box. This is like when I went to go, I met Noam Chomsky. We hung out. Maybe I'll give that one to my nephews or something. And then, actually, I doubt you want to read Chomsky. I don't know if you do or not. I'll ask you. But then we've got like The Hidden Persuaders, Secrets of the Tomb. This is like, Hidden Persuaders is about propaganda. It's pretty good. Secrets of the Hidden Tomb is about the Skull and Bones. You know, all this kind of stuff you have to take with a grain of salt a little bit, because it's people writing popular novels about controversial subjects. The one that you absolute trash is Conspirators' Hierarchy, the story of the Committee of 300. This is really best for reading if you just want to train yourself on disinformation. So like by reading this and familiarizing yourself with the words that come out of here, when you hear those repeated in the real world, that's someone who read this book and thinks they know what's going on. That person's probably a fucking idiot. So like when you hear people saying things like useless eaters or useless whatever, like all of this like cloak and dagger, hidden knowledge, this guy was a complete charlatan. He completely made up the figure. He published under Dr. John Coleman, was not a doctor. John Coleman wasn't even his name. He was just a complete charlatan. And the PDF that everybody always circulates is actually, you get it from the CIA website. So it's like this really funny thing to me that like, you have like James Lindsay and like all of these other, you know, Corbett and all of the conspiracy people. Well, James Lindsay, he's not a conspiracy, but you know what I mean? Like the people who are just kind of not really getting into this stuff, but they pretend like they have secret knowledge. A lot of them are just hijacking it directly from this guy who was like the ultimate pretender of secret knowledge. So that's why I have it. Just feel like it needs to come with an explanation. I'll throw these in there too. This one you probably won't want. That's just a friend's book. And yeah, that should just about do it, man. So maybe 3 boxes coming at you.